when I became a Christian and God challenged me with that question, what does it now mean to be a Christian as a CEO? The first thing I did is, what we do as business people is we go out and we ask questions and we find people who are in the same place and we learn and we think about best practices. And so I went out and spoke to a bunch of people who were in leading positions as Christians in companies. And it was fascinating that the summary of, I think, what I heard was, you got to do two things. Number one is you've got to work ethically. And number two, you've got to be prepared if anybody wants to talk about faith and Jesus, you've got to be prepared to talk about Jesus. And look, those two things are wonderful. And you're not going to hear from me that you shouldn't do either of those things. But the question that came to me very strongly was, is that all? I mean, we're spending all this time at work. I mean, is that all we're doing is just make sure you work ethically? And if someone wants to talk to you about Jesus, you're ready to talk about Jesus. And yeah, so I started reading books because that wasn't really satisfying. And there weren't really any very good, deep books on, there are people who were talking about their own lives and there were wonderful stories, but there was not a lot of what I would call theology. In other words, it's a big highfalutin word, but what does God say about this particular thing? Because that's what I wanted to know, right? When you're a newcomer to the kingdom, the only thing you care about is what does God say? I've been introduced to the Father. I want to sit at my Father's feet and I want to hear what my Father is saying. And so the only place I could go then was back to Scripture, right? Because there was nowhere else to go. And interesting enough, what I found in Scripture was that there are really three great mandates in Scripture. There's the great commandment, right? To love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And that's the greatest commandment. Jesus says that's the greatest commandment, no question. The second commandment that most of us think all the time is the Great Commission, right? Matthew. And that's obviously the mandate to evangelize. But when you open Genesis 1 and 2, you find another mandate. It's called the cultural or the creation mandate, which is we are given, the earth and all of God's creation to steward or to look after or to manage. And as I began to think about why people talked about doing what was right and helping people learn about Jesus, what I recognized is those were those first two mandates. There was the Great Commandment and the Great Commission. And when you think about what happens at church, that's primarily what gets talked about at church, the Great Commandment and the Great Commission. Personal holiness on the one hand and reaching out as a church to evangelize and bring people to Jesus. Again, wonderful things. But the church almost never speaks about the cultural mandate, which is living every day in the workplace, which is where all of us in the congregation live for the majority of our time. And yet the church is kind of silent on that. And so you get this sort of, one-sided Christianity focusing on God and focusing on personal holiness and focusing on evangelism, but not this whole aspect of work. And it's not therefore surprising when you talk to most Christians in the workplace, they're really kind of confused. Why am I working? What's the purpose of my work? Is it just to make money? And if so, how much money is enough? And, those are the kinds of questions you get into. But there's really not a deeper sense of what's the purpose of work? Why do we work? A lot of discussion about how, but not a lot of discussion about why. And so that's really where I started my thinking and my research, basically coming out of Genesis chapter 2. Mm-hmm. And in Genesis chapter 2, most people start with 2:15 that says, "And God put the man in the garden to tend and work the garden." And that's clearly a work mandate and a cultural mandate. But it's kind of interesting because if you go a little earlier to 2:5, God has created this. The creation exists. But it says in 2:5 that nothing was growing, nothing was happening. And it gives two reasons for nothing being productive. One is there was no water, and we kind of figure that out. If there's no water, nothing's growing. We get that. But the second thing is this: there was no man to work it. That just struck me. And he obviously solves that problem. In 2:6, he brings water from the deep, etc., and rain. And in 2:7, he obviously creates man from dust. So there's a problem in 2:5. It's not productive. He solves the two problems in 2:6 and 2:7. But I started to think about that, and I said, wait a minute, God could have done this creation thing any way he wants to. But we as human beings, he's created us to be an integral part of his creation. In other words, without us, his creation doesn't move forward. Because don't forget, we start in the garden, we finish in the city, right? If you start in Genesis 1-2 and you end up in Revelation 21-22, you end up in those perfect places in community with God. But we're not going back to the garden. We're going to a very complex city with many, many people. And this is what God is doing. His creation is progressing to the benefit and flourishing of humankind as we go along. And we as humans are part of that process. In fact, we are vital to that, because without us, it doesn't happen. And all of a sudden, work suddenly moved to me from being a thing that you had to do as a utilitarian kind of exercise to be able to make money to do whatever, or more often, unfortunately, it's an exercise in idolatry, right? Look at me, and it was for me. It was an exercise of idolatry and pride as much as anything else. But work moves from that to being a fundamental co-creation with God of the progression of his creation from a garden to a city.